Kinneret Lahad, thank you so much for joining me and a truly warm welcome to Thrive Solo. I'm honored to have you here and I can't wait to get into this conversation. But before we do, can you just tell our listeners just a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, you're welcome.
I'm currently an associate professor and the head of the gender studies program at Tel Aviv University in Israel. I'm a proud aunt for four nieces and one nephew, and aunthood is an important position in my life. I'm also very lucky to have wonderful friends, wonderful good friends. Perhaps we can talk about that as well in the interview. And as we talked before, I love taking photos. I love walking in nature and meeting new people and having interesting conversations.
You're a girl after my own heart. And funnily enough, it's funny because you say you've got four nieces and one nephew. I've got four nephews and one niece. And I also love them. Kinneret, let me start by asking you how you ended up researching single life and how you came to do the research for your book, A Table for One, A Critical Reading of Singlehood, Gender and Time. How did this come about?
There was no clear departure point that I could identify, but I think as we are all socialized in to a very heteronormative and a very patriarchal society. So from a very early age, we are constantly bombarded by messages about our future, about our present, about our competence as women who are supposed to be married and have children, who are supposed to be gorgeous looking, who are supposed to be nice, to be pleasant, to smile a lot, which I do, by the way, but I see it as a resistance to patriarchy and not necessarily incorporating its messages. So there was no clear departure point. And when I began writing my PhD, I had a totally different issue at mind. I thought about writing about compassion. My thesis, my master thesis, was on an entirely different topic. I analyzed scripts of rescue from a post-colonial perspective. So actually, I was very curious to develop this kind of compassion angle, which I'm still very bothered by it, given the horrible political war that's taking place at the moment, and asking a lot of questions about compassion and empathy. But we won't talk about that today. And all of a sudden, at some point, writing my PhD, I realized that many of the questions that bothered me during my master thesis have responded or I have inquired. And I all of a sudden I said, okay, I'm going to write about single women. I'm going to write about shame and single women. And so I started looking for research. And besides Bella De Paulo's amazing studies, which I know you have met and you are influenced by her, and I think we really are, we owe Bella so much
I know.
for her really innovative work. But apart from her, most of the studies I found in these books about marriage and family life, and then there were the others, the single woman as the others. And they were quite empirical, there was no language, alternative language to talk about singlehood. There were discussions about what Bella De Paula rightly and beautifully says, singleism, the stereotypes and stigmas which are attached to single women, but there was no actually messy theoretical ground which could, for me as a researcher and as a single woman who identifies as a single woman as an important part of her identity, there were no explanations that were convincing for me beyond the heteronormative ideal. What gives these stigmas and stereotypes so much discursive force when the world is constantly changing, when we have all kinds of different living arrangements, when you can, of course, it always depends when, at what age, in which context, but there are more options to imagine yourself growing up as a woman, but still the couple culture and the couple kind of imagery is so strong. And then I realized that if I will keep on researching shame, I will not get the answers I'm looking for. And I realized that most of the stereotypes and most of the cliches and questions women are addressed are often grounded in temporal scripts of schedules and clocks and the language of time. For example, how long have you been single and when are you going to get married? Or how come up you ended up being a single woman? Or you'll miss the train. Oh, it's such a pity. She used to be so pretty. And don't worry, you'll get married soon or next. And I realized that I need to deconstruct these messages and understand the power of temporal norms has on women and the way through temporality, heteronormativity justifies itself, and heteronormativity has very convincing, of course, commas, on what is true and what is just and what is normal. And you use the language of time and the imagery of time, especially notions of age and the life course. And these are very difficult to deconstruct and challenge. So that was the main project in my book, not in my, I've written also quite a few articles which do not analyze time, but that was the project. I wanted to create a different way to think about singlehood and understand the discursive force of, these stigmas and stereotypes, and why still, even if we realize that we might be okay living single, you still have this constant doubt.
Yeah.
Why? Is it maybe other people are happier? Maybe other people have it more easier. And why am I still in this path? So I thought that the sociology and anthropology of time gave me so many analytical tools to reconceptualize singlehood.
It's so incredibly fascinating. And you've obviously done some real cutting edge work on this idea of time when it comes to single people. And like you say, the idea that there is this life timetable that we have to adhere to. And if we deviate from that, then there is something wrong with us. Can you speak to this notion that there is something wrong with single people, dare I say, particularly single women, and how this sort of pertains to your research around time?
Yeah. I've recently participated in a fantastic edited book, which is open access, by the way, about being single in Asia.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, it's a fantastic book, just came out with Heidelberg University Press. I can
What's it
send you
what's
the
it called, Kinneret?
because I'm middle-aged, I don't remember the title exactly. And I'm going through severe menopause at the moment.
Oh, I hear you. I hear you.
But after our conversation, I'll send you a link. It's
Okay, cool.
fantastic and I highly recommend it.
I can put the
Um,
link in the show notes.
yeah, so over there, I analyzed the idea of the leftover woman in China,
Oh,
the
wow.
way women are called left over after a certain age
Oh,
if they're not married. And the very idea of being left over, of not being able to participate in the market of you cannot be exchanged as a good who has market value after a certain age. Even if you say, oh, that's rubbish, the stigma is so strong and it has so many ways in which you can ask yourself, oh, why didn't this happen? What is wrong with me? Or will I be able to maintain my market value before I lose it completely? So the very idea, this very kind of old idea that women are exchanged, that men exchange women as goods, that the patriarchal gaze looks at women, what does this woman say about my market value? And what is the market value of women according to their looks, according to their age, according to their fertility potential, etc., etc. Things that are still very much happening. And you enter any Tinder or any app, you completely see it as if nothing has changed at all. I was really struck by this leftover, which is not a metaphor. It is something that the Chinese government initiated. And by the way, as we all know, there are far more single men in China than single women. So you can really see how this kind of propaganda, which was aimed to educated, middle class, which are considered to be good marriageable material to have children, were called leftover to humiliate them and to pressure them into getting married. And what I did in this paper, among other things, I also related to that as a moral panic, how a moral panic is created by these terms, but also how the interplay of absence and emptiness as well as excess. So the leftover woman is excessive, just as I've written in a different paper, I've written about selectiveness, that you are you have an excessive choice, which you're not using it. And on the other hand, they are lacking something. They are devoid of something. And in Hebrew, the word ravaka comes from the word rek, which is a void, emptiness. This whole kind of imagery that even you may on an everyday basis. I don't like this kind of happy single, I choose singlehood every day of my life. I'm a bit critical of that because I think it tends to simplify the complexity and ambivalence we might have in our lives, which might not be entirely related to being single, by the way. We might not be happy because there are many reasons not to be happy. But that's maybe, if we'll have time, we'll talk about it later. But the fact that this kind of interpolation, that you're constantly interpolated as someone who is lacking, as the outsider, as someone who has not succeeded to get the attention of men or to get a man to... I remember a few years ago, I met someone who was my teacher at high school. And of course, the first thing she asked me if I'm married with children. And I said to her, I don't. And she said, but you did have proposals, right? Men did want you. And I said to her, I will not participate in this conversation. I'm not participating in this kind of logic in which I have to justify my value, that, I'm normal because I am waiting for a man to approve my value. It's these kinds of conversations when I start talking and I'm not sure that the other person is still in the same conversation with me. But that's a very reoccurring conversation single women have. And it's very important to really challenge this kind of logic in which you have to justify yourself to strangers, to other people, in which you constantly compare yourselves to others. Just as I think many people who are very critical of neoliberalism and capitalism, we always object the way people are compared to one another according to their class or according to how much they earn. You cannot compare people according to these kinds of invented categories.
Yeah, completely. I just want to pick up on the idea of waiting. I know is obviously something you talk a lot about in A Table for One.
Yeah.
This idea that we're waiting for a partner or we're standing in line, and the idea that when we're single and waiting, we lack control in a way that other people don't. Can you go into this idea of waiting a little bit more and your research and what you've written about this?
In relation to that's an example of how good sociological research on temporality and waiting was absolutely mind-blowing in terms of the possibilities it offered to reconceptualize the very well-worn image of the waiting single woman.
Yeah.
And for example, one of the things I worked with, the imagery of the queue, of standing in line.
Yeah.
And I looked at studies which research queue is a system. queue as a system, and how, in a bit of even a structural way, of how the queue is imagined and who can stand in line and who cannot even stand in line because of their age, because of what society conceives as being an attractive woman, and who has missed the line and who can just take photos of other people waiting in line and who is kicked off the line. Even standing in line as this linear progression in which you are waiting for a prize. And I thought of all these romantic comedies, but also everyday realities in which women wait for their bouquet to be thrown at them
Oh my
as this
God.
kind of,
Yeah. The throwing of the bouquet at a wedding. Oh God.
yeah, yeah, and how much fun it's supposed to be. So I thought of there, I haven't written everything I thought because it deserves a book of its own, just this ritual. But I thought of the publicity of this throwing of the bouquet and the fact that women, not men, are supposed to be standing and waiting to be next, waiting to be move on with their lives and presenting themselves in all these kinds of ceremonies where women are supposed to present yourself, and you are waiting to be saved. You are waiting to begin your life, the beginning of the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And I thought that the queue as a system which really demonstrates inequalities, for example, economical inequalities, the fact that when you have more resources, you don't have to stand so much in queues. You can pay other people to stand in line for you, or you can pay for the expensive. You can drive through toll roads to bypass the queues and traffic, or you can fly first class. You don't have to wait in line. So this kind of logic of what kind of resources enable you to move ahead
Mm.
and move ahead towards a prize that awaits you, which is marriage and, of course, children afterwards. And the fact that it's public and the fact that you are hyper visible in that respect,
Yeah.
and people can approach you and wish you to get married next and get married soon, assuming that's your goal in life, assuming that's what you've been dreaming about forever and ever. A very kind of, in my view, a very narrow kind of vision of what kind of lives and prizes and what is important in life.
Yeah. This is the thing, is one of the things that the world seems to forget, and it blows my mind on a regular basis, is the fact that we put marriage and babies on this pedestal, and subsequently we forget about the millions of other things that we can be doing with our lives, and the many infinite other ways that we can find fulfillment and happiness and joy. And also how crazy it can seem that people to this day in 2025, when we know what the statistics are around marriage, and we also are very aware of the realities of getting married and having babies and how incredibly hard it can be. It's not like we don't hear about this. It's not like it's not portrayed in the media and we're not seeing it in the papers and all the rest of it. Yet despite all of that, people are still chasing this ideal of what we're supposed to do. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Ah, it's something I think about now every day. I'm thinking about the horrible war here. And as someone who has opposed occupation and war for so many years, I keep asking the same question. It's like a parallel, this ideal of nationality and that of land, and so many Palestinians, Jews suffering so much from this ongoing wars, and still the solution is another war and another war. I know I just couldn't resist because this is the kind of logic that I keep thinking about. Not only me, everyone is
Yeah.
bothered, like Until when? Until when?
Yeah.
The same questions we can ask about capitalism, how all these systems make us so miserable, so vulnerable. And there are so many alternative ways to live. There are so many alternative ways to be together, to create communities which are based on different values. And still, you see these bunch of men ruling and destroying the world at the moment, constantly, every day. So sorry for being off topic for a
No, no, no.
second.
Please don't apologize at all. And in fact, let me just interject there and go off on a slight tangent in relation to something that you just said, because I wanted to ask you and talk to you about or hear your thoughts about this consumerist society that we live in and how it's very inconvenient for our consumerist society when people don't get married and have babies, right? Because it means we're not going to buy the baby stuff. We're not going to take the family holidays. We're not going to get the second car. It's so incredibly inconvenient for the patriarchy and
Yeah.
for this society that we live in. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because on the one hand, that's clear. Just as the leftover women, you're not one of the most important identities we are ascribed is to be a consumer. So the fact that we might not be dreaming of consuming and we continue to destroy the world in this overconsumption, as we know already so
Yeah.
well, but still consumerism is big as ever. And but what is really interesting in this kind of dynamic, which is tricky because there are more and more single people in the world, and there are more and more people who live on their own and have then particular needs which do not necessarily overlap with the consumerist needs of the family. And then you would wonder, why hasn't capitalism is very good in the capitalist system is very good in identifying the new market and co-opting the new market, just as people who retire are a huge market for the system. Or if there are so many fascinating studies done of the LGBTQ communities and the fact that you can co-opt this and cater and create a market. And there have been efforts to cater to single people, to offer solo holidays or self-help books, or even in Korea, for example, in department stores, there are sections. I don't know if it's still there. I don't know how long it survived, but there were efforts to target single people. And I don't know how it is in the UK. In my recent visits, I've never noticed this kind of phenomena, which caters in department stores, for
No.
example, or in supermarkets. I'm not
No, no, no,
missing
no,
a
no, no, you're
huge
not.
thing that's happening
No,
in the
you're
UK
not.
at the moment.
You're not. You still walk into every supermarket and it's like a meal for two. And I certainly don't know of any department stores that you can walk into where there's a section that caters to single people. No, maybe I don't spend a lot of time in department stores. Maybe I'm wrong in that, but not as far as I know. So I think we're singing from the same hymn sheet here.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to think of capitalism doesn't care about values. It just wants to create a new market and invent new needs. Here is a great market. It's a fantastic market. And allegedly, just as the gay couple were the ideal consumer unit, because allegedly, according to the stereotypes, they don't have children, which of course changes a lot recently, but still that's a consumer kind of unit. And how come the single person is not in a very attractable unit?
Especially as we're growing in numbers.
Yeah, growing in numbers. And there is one example, but it's related to Onto It, which if I'll have time, I'll exemplify that.
Yeah, please do.
Oh, okay. So there is really one interesting example, which I've written with Professor Vanessa May from Manchester University, which is an aunt entrepreneur called Melanie King.
I've interviewed her for this podcast.
Oh,
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. So I'm pronouncing her name right, I hope.
Melanie Notkin, yeah.
Okay. So she has really incredibly managed to create the aunt as a consumerist category.
Yeah.
And there is a wonderful paper that analyzes that particular angle that was published before Vanessa and myself have written about it. Vanessa and myself have not written about the consumerist elements, but watching a lot of Melanie Notkin's videos, it's amazing the way she has created a consumer niche for the cool aunt who purchases the right kind of presents and having a day for aunts to have a fun day with their nieces and nephews. Given that, you still wonder how come the single woman is not such a consumerist niche? And I don't have a very simple answer, but I think that the couple unit and the romanticized couple unit and the way I think consumer culture works and also the advertisements constantly lean on these coupled units or friends groups. You don't lean on the single. If you're single, then your singlehood is not the main identity, or if you're single, you are looking for a partner. But single as a permanent or a semi-permanent way of life is not attractable for
because everybody assumes
advertising campaigns.
And I think it's partly probably because everybody assumes that single people are desperately trying to unsingle themselves, so therefore it's not a kind of a valid market because that's not what people supposedly want. But it is crazy because the numbers of single people are growing year by year. The predictions for 2030, I can't remember what it is, but I wish I could quote the number, but I know that by 2030, it's predicted that there's going to be a whole lot more singles, which is very interesting.
I think, sorry.
Here you go.
I think there might be more reasons for that as well, because we want to purchase something because we want to be that kind of person in the ad, and who wants to be a single person? So this is not the kind of person you want to identify with. This is like the warning sign. You can be glamorous in your 20s or early 30s, but why should you sell something that is perceived to be a failure or unhappiness? That's not promising anything.
Yeah. This just made me think of something I wanted to ask you about, which is going off topic, but it's just making me think of that kind of washed up old spinster type, that sort of classic stereotype around single women of a certain age. My age, I might add, being 49, because I am mad about music. And I know that you have taken a lot of inspiration from popular culture and more specifically music and songs. And you talked about this juxtaposition between two very well-known songs, one being The Man I Love by Ella Fitzgerald and then Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles. These two completely different women being portrayed by these two, obviously by Ella Fitzgerald as a solo singer and then by the Beatles as a band. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah. I remember when I thought of these songs and their messages about what kind of future awaits women. So the words are incredible when you attend to them closely. The kind of messages that one is waiting for the man I love. She doesn't even know who he is. It's just the waiting and being socialized for, and these kinds of longings that you're supposed to constantly long. There is constantly something that is missing. So no wonder diamond rings are much more promising. I'm single and my life is okay kind of ring. And all the patriarchal kinds of messages. He'll be big and strong. And it's a beautiful song, by the way. But the words are just unbelievable. And on the other hand, Eleanor Rigby, this kind of spinster who no one comes to her funeral and all she has to do is wait by the window aimlessly, because it's even ridiculous to wait at a certain age. You're not supposed to wait anymore. You're supposed to just look back at your life with regrets and a sense of failure. And it's interesting, in the first chapter in my book, I talked about this kind of imaginary life course that the single women is categorized So at a certain age, she's still a promise, and then following on, she's a promise which is any second can be a failure. And then at a certain age, you are finally, people are letting go of you and stop asking you questions and stop wishing you to get married next or soon. But from time to time, they would ask, what happened? What went wrong? What didn't you do right? What didn't you do? Give us an account. Please give us an account. And at the beginning of my book, I talk about, actually now I'm writing a new paper in which I revisit this account from a distance of 15 years. And so I wrote this account, I think, when I was 35. I wrote it down for the first time, and now I'm 52. So I'm looking at this account from my position as a 52-year-old woman.
Which is
And
a
of
very,
course,
very different position as a woman compared to being 35. You are in a very different position in the eyes of society when you're a 52-year-old woman like me. I mean, a couple of years behind you, but it's almost, I think the likes of you and I are able to like laugh at it. But what pains me and what I hope to do with this podcast and all of my kind of content is to help other women start to shed the shame and the embarrassment and do what you and I can do, which is look at it and be like, oh my God, it's so ridiculous, rather than be affected by it directly. Oh my God, like you're saying, look back and go, oh, I don't quite know where my life went wrong and blah, 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 blah. My mission is to flip that,
mhm,
completely flip that. And in fact, and this is something I'd love to ask you a little bit about, and instead look at the fabulous lives that single women without kids are living. You being a case in point, all of the things that you're doing with your life as a single childless woman. But anyway, sorry, going back to what you were saying about now being
yeah,
52 in comparison to when you were 35.
yeah, yeah, I completely agree with you. And at the same time, I also, for me, it's very important also to stress that we are also allowed to have doubts sometimes because these messages are so strong. And at different junctures in our life, we are able to challenge them, and at different times we are not.
Yeah,
And it's okay as well.
yeah.
A while ago, I was taking the highway, and both of my tires exploded in the middle of the highway.
Oh my
Yeah,
God,
yeah.
crikey.
And I found myself with tears in my eyes because I was terrified. And like a Cinderella story, a guy stopped and helped me. And at these kinds of junctures in your life, you might say, "Oh, if there was someone with me in the car, maybe I would have been left terrified." And or if I could call immediately someone, and that sometimes being in a coupled relationship makes it allegedly safer, because sometimes these ideals get to you when you're not prepared,
Yeah.
and it's absolutely fine to look at it and understand the grip that they have on you.
It speaks to the duality that so many of us live with. You can be happily single and you can still hope for a relationship. You can be happily child free, but you can still be sad that you never had kids.
Mhm.
And I think this is what you're speaking to, this idea that
Yeah,
we can feel more than one thing at the same time.
exactly, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And even that, going to the place where they fixed my car, I felt so competent afterwards. I did it all by myself. I said how lucky I am to earn a salary that I could pay for new tires. I was very grateful for many things. There are moments that all of a sudden you feel alone and you're tired of doing everything by yourself for so many years. And it's fine. And it's fine to be tired. And it's fine also to realize that it could have been possible that kind of help would not have been the help you would have wanted if you were in a relationship. And for example, that kind of partner would have said to you, "Oh, look at the way you drive. I'm just kidding, of course. It's not that. Of course, we're constantly negotiating these ideals, and the presence of these ideals also within us, the way they effectively have a hold of us. But when we analyze it critically, we can also think of ways to give space to this power, but also constantly think of ways we can challenge it and
Yeah,
understand the kind of brainwashing we're constantly subjected to.
absolutely. Do you know what this makes me think, actually? I talk a lot about how the thing about being single and not having kids and living the life that you or I are living, right? It's just a different path because at
Mhm.
the end of the day, either path, you go, whether you are married with kids or you are
Yeah,
single without them, whichever road you go down in life, there is going to be light and there is going to be shade. But the
yeah,
problem is that in that situation where you have a doubled freaking tire blowout on the middle of the highway and wish you were in a relationship, that somehow seems more urgent, or you somehow seem like your lack of a man is worse than, say, for example, flipping that around to a married couple and the mother who regrets the dreams that she had to give up because she had kids. So it's
yeah,
whatever life you live, there is always going to be things that you're going to regret or you couldn't do or you didn't do because of the path that you went down. But we are
exactly.
made to feel that it's much worse. The things that you lack, supposedly, when you're single and you don't have kids is much worse than the things that you potentially lack when you're married and you do have them. We hold up the all the wonderful things about being married with kids, but we don't talk about the darker sides of it. Whereas with it, when it comes to single life without kids, we hold up the shitty things about being single and not having kids, and we don't talk about the wonderful things that can actually come with it and the benefits and the opportunities and the freedoms and all of that. It's so unfair. The scales are just so weighted in the direction of this world that is built for couples. And I have a book coming out in June, and I talk
Oh,
in this,
Mazal
yeah.
Tov.
The, sorry.
Congratulations. Mazal Tov in Hebrew.
Oh my,
It was very
thank,
automatic.
thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you
How
so much.
wonderful.
And I talk about essentially it's basically about leveling the playing field. It's like we've got to level the field. It's just become so ridiculous how the weights are just so, the balance is so far in the direction of being married and not and having kids. That
Yeah.
does that make sense? What that whole
Yeah, I
spiel?
agree. I agree with you more than 100% because I think that there is a hierarchy between these paths, and the
Yes.
hierarchy is stupid. The
Yeah.
hierarchy doesn't make any sense. It's illogical.
Yes.
When I've written my book and when I write these papers, I never claim that single life is better than being coupled, but I don't claim the other thing as well. I challenge the hierarchy. I
Yeah.
challenge this kind of gaze and this kind of interpolation we are constantly subjected to, that there is one life which is better. So in a way, I think that our scholarship of people who write about singlehood is not only for single women and men, it's also for people in relationships as well.
Yeah.
Because if you live in a relationship which is not necessarily happy all the time, to realize also the idealization of couplehood and marriage life on the one hand, and also the fact that if you decide to divorce, it's not the end of your life.
Yeah.
It's definitely not. It can be for many reasons, which are structural and economical. Of
Mm.
course, there is no wonder why divorce is very bad economically, which wonderful scholars have written about this. But I think when you rethink singlehood in such a way, you actually, what I think is very important is to open different paths for living and thinking and feeling, which is very important.
Mm.
Not to feel as a failure or someone who is missing out on the big prize waiting at the end of the queue.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I really want to get your take on actually is this idea, because I think another narrative around singlehood and not having kids is this idea that we're not fully adult, that we haven't grown up, that we're still kids. Can you give me your thoughts around this whole thing? Because I know it's something that you have
Yeah,
talked about before, so I'd love to hear what you've got to say about
yeah.
it.
Here, I don't remember if I've actually written about this, but I think that what I want to do is follow queer scholars here and ask what's so great about adulthood to begin with, to rethink
Absolutely.
about the idea of adulthood vis-a-vis responsibility, vis-a-vis rationality, vis-a-vis getting a mortgage, having bills. What's so great about adulthood that we idolize it in such a way? Because being a child, having conversations with children, now I'm idolizing a bit as someone who adores, like my one of my favorite things is talking to children. Maybe when I'll retire, I'll have a podcast just to talk to kids. They have, they're so curious. They have so many
Yeah.
interesting things to say and so many interesting questions. What's so great about being an adult?
Right.
And what's so terrible about being a child?
Childlike. Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
also, I love the fact that you mentioned the word curious because it's almost as we move into adulthood, it's like all of the wonderful things about being a kid, like curiosity and like wonder and awe, and all of those things are gradually just bashed out of us. And
yeah,
actually, the crazy thing is that we're all aspiring to be these sort of responsible adults and live these adult lives. But actually, the freaking best bits about life are all of the things that we leave behind in childhood. So actually, I love the fact that if someone wants to call me childlike, I take that as a huge compliment. I make a point of being childlike. I think I am inherently just by nature. I still have that curiosity and I still have that sort of enthusiasm for things and that
yeah,
excitement for things. But why wouldn't we want that? These incredible characteristics of being more childlike. What's wrong
yeah.
with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also with also being careful not idolizing childhood as opposed to adulthood, I think we should talk about values. What kind of people do we want to be and what is important? Is buying a house, is that more important than showing empathy to other people, than doing good, to being really interested in other people, in the welfare of animals and the planet? We as adults haven't been doing such a good job doing all these things given where we are at the moment. But this is another kind of disciplinary way in which you are told you're not really living the life.
Yeah.
Who is telling you what is life about? Is life about just the way you are living it? Great, enjoy it, have a blast. But this kind of you're still stuck being a child, you're missing out. And these are very, of course, very bourgeois and very capitalist kind of notions.
Yeah. And again, it goes
So
back, doesn't it, to this sort of this unwritten timeline that we have made up that isn't even real. It's like
yeah,
we're stuck back at the end of that queue rather than
yeah,
we've never got to the front of the queue kind of thing.
yeah,
It's crazy. One thing before we start thinking about wrapping up, because I've realized I've had you nearly an hour already, but I really want to ask you about your personal experience of a single child-free life. And obviously, this podcast is called Thrive Solo. So
yeah,
I would love you to speak to the things that you love about being single
ah,
and what thriving solo looks like to you.
yeah. Ah, wow, what a wonderful question. I never thought about it this way. I cannot separate my me being single to the privileges I have in life, to the kind of privileges, which is, of course, me being middle class, me being in a profession which I get a salary every month, me having a passport, having citizenship. So I cannot separate them from the privileges I have
Mm,
as a single woman. But I think as someone who loves to read and think, there is this sweetness of the time I have by myself to dream and to be quiet and to process things
mm.
without being constantly distracted, which is a huge privilege. And I think I've loved that ever since childhood. I remember that in beginning primary school, I just discovered books and I realized, wow, I can be in my own world. I can invent and disconnect from things that I didn't like in the adult life. And in a way, I think I continue that path in many ways, also in my career as an academic, which allows me to read and allows me to meet curious people all the time, which is something I adore about my work. You teach students, and most of the time they're super curious in what you share with them, in what you the things that you can share your knowledge and you learn so much from them. So I think the sweetness, it's a really sweet moment when I wake up in the morning by myself and all I want to do is write and read, and I can do that. That is a super, super privileged position, which I think not necessarily aiming or planning, but this is something I really love about my life, that I have a lot of quiet and a lot of time to just stare at the ceiling and think about things, or just don't think about anything and just have time to process. I don't have to be constantly oriented to the approval of others or to the gaze of others. And also because I have a chronic illness called fibromyalgia, which makes me very exhausted. So I need time to recharge, to be outside. So I think singlehood in many ways, my single life allows me. I don't know how I would have survived this illness if I would have constantly needed to be in interaction and having a schedule which is very much dependent on other people's schedule. So I do realize that's also a privilege I have, which I think many women with fibromyalgia do not have. And they talk about their need, that they need, their battery is totally empty and they need to recharge. So it's also thriving, but I think it's also, for me, in a way, surviving with a very difficult illness. It's all entangled together.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. One thing, I love the fact that you use the word sweetness. And it's something I've talked about quite a bit, is the fact that we do have this sort of peace in our lives. And I think this is one of the most underrated things about one of the most underrated benefits and advantages of being single and not having kids, is this peace and quiet that just doesn't really get talked about, because it is huge. It is a huge privilege. And I think it's this sort of, it's having the headspace to, like you say, just think and process and dream and be creative in a way that perhaps married mums don't have that. They're not afforded that. And it is a luxury. But again, this just speaks to something I go on about all the time, which is there are so many things about being single that we just don't talk about enough. We just don't think about enough that actually are really fabulous. One thing that I want to just go right the way back to, you mentioned you have fabulous friends, and I just wanted to go back to this idea of community and how being single and not having kids does not mean that you are this lonely, miserable person. It is, I feel in my life, like I have a handful of very good friends. I have my family, have a lot of connection in my life. I don't feel like I'm lacking love of any kind. I really don't. I feel so connected. I feel like I have all of my emotional needs met by other people without requiring the emotional whatever from a romantic partner. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, that interviewing, because I'm now writing about friendship and I conducted a research in which I interviewed with a wonderful health research assistant, interviews with women from Israel and the UK about their life through their close friends. And this is not talked about enough as well, the way friendship can be so meaningful.
Yeah.
in your life, also in ways which can make you unhappy and miserable and troubled. It's not only fun and games, but what I'm talking about is the importance of friendship in your life. And again, this kind, when you are told you will end up living up alone, there are so many stories which are untold about how friends can care for one another and supply practical help and emotional support and support when you are ill and when you are unconfident. These stories of people who became chronically ill, and there are like WhatsApp groups of taking care of that particular friend who is going to stay with her during that day. Beautiful, beautiful stories, but that this kind of neoliberal kind of thinking that the family is supposed to take the place of
Yeah.
the state is cooperating here, this kind of neoliberal logic with the couple culture and the family culture that,
Mm.
of course, when we talk about care, we should stress the importance of the state to take care of us, the enormous amounts of money we give to the state to take care of us when we are unable to take care of ourselves. And so I'm not saying that friends will replace the state, absolutely not. But friendship can be a very significant source of care and meaning, which is not talked about enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Have you read Raina Cohen's book? Have you heard of Raina Cohen?
Yeah, but I'm not sure I've read which
She
book.
read, oh, hang on, it's called, I've got it here. It's called The Other Significant Others. You should absolutely,
Ah,
most
okay.
certainly read it. Yeah,
Okay.
you
I'm
must read it.
writing it down.
Yeah, do,
Yeah,
do,
no,
do.
I've heard about it, but I have not read it. I've
Yeah,
not,
the other significant others.
yeah.
It's been just such a joy to speak to you, and I'm so grateful that you came on the podcast. Truly, there's so many other things that I could ask you, but let me just finish by asking you if there's
Sure.
anything that I have missed that you would like to say to the single women who are listening to this podcast, perhaps particularly the ones who are still very much weighed down by those feelings of shame and those societal stories and narratives, the ones that are really struggling with them. Is there anything that you feel like you'd like to share with them?
Yeah. Maybe that it's okay to feel down from time to time because you are dealing with decades of patriarchy and heteronormativity, which even when we say, okay, we have understood how patriarchy tells us how to be women of a particular kind, still it has so much force. And we are socialized to these ideals from such an early age, and we're constantly reminded by them in so many ways. So it's okay also to understand and incorporate them emotionally and live with them. But I think that there are such wonderful resources that one can be reminded of this movement in which you are seen as a particular person who are supposed to feel something and to do something in a particular way. And if we can see this kind as an ideology which is constantly attached to us, and even sometimes laugh at it, at how ridiculous it is, and how absurd it is, and how it is often a bullshit of industry. I'm just quoting here another wonderful study about bullshit jobs, but I thought a lot about this as bullshit can be helpful. And hearing your podcast,
Mm.
reading your forthcoming book, reading alternative stories, there is so much out there which today I think really offers a fantastic alternative.
Yeah, yeah, it's such wise words. I agree with you so wholeheartedly on this. I think it's what we're consuming is so important, and it's very important that we are looking, that single women are looking for intentionally finding other stories
Yeah.
of single women who are thriving and who are living fabulous lives like yourself. It really is so important. Thank you so much
Thank
for your
you. Thank
time.
you.
It's
It was so
been
interesting.
it's just been so lovely to talk to you, and I really do appreciate your time and sending you so much love, and thanks a million for being here.
My pleasure. And please stay in touch. Tell me how you are and wishing you
Absolutely.
all the best.
Thank
Really.
you. Thank you so much.